Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to tonight's We'll Talk with Artists. My name is Martha Campbell, and I'm MFA's Communications Manager. Our digital discussion tonight is with artist Alan Hirsh. Alan uses proprietary software to mathematically paint and alter images, creating work that ranges from an obscure reality to completely beyond comprehension. As a kind of fun side note and history about MFA, Alan is actually the reason why Digital Directions has been transformed into a digital media exhibition. Since his work actually wouldn't have been able to qualify under Focal Point's original description. So I would also like to introduce the host of our show, Wil Scott. Wil is an art historian with an extensive career as a photographer, and he's the recently retired head of adult programs for the National Gallery of Arts. Wil is also on MFA's board of directors, and we believe that he is uniquely qualified to help bridge the gap between artists and the public.
Hey, thank you, Martha, for that nice introduction. And thank you, Alan, for both initiating the digital show by talking with Joanne Vaughn, our executive director, and also thank you for agreeing to be tonight's guest on the show. And I think we're all going to learn a great deal, because I know that as a digital photographer, when I saw your images, when I see your images, I really can't explain or fully understand how they're created, and that's what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. But first, I also want to say I see a lot of new names and some new faces. So thank you all for tuning in. And looks like we're going to have a good group this evening. So Alan, first, I know that you are a physicist, but if you want to just try to quickly explain how you got from a career and training as a physicist to creating the art that you're creating now, that'll be a sort of a foundation for us to talk about the actual images and processes.
Well, in 1992, my wife and I had our first child, my son, and I was a very nervous new parent. And my brother, who was a trained fine artist, graduated art school with honors in California, wanted me to do something for him, but he sort of tricked me into it. He called me up. At that time, I was not a particularly good computer programmer. I sort of eschewed it in college, even though I had tremendous opportunities where I went to college to learn it. I could do it, but I wasn't very good. But he called me up. He said, "Why don't you do fractal art? It'll relax you."
Mm-hmm.
He'd already had a child, and he knew how nervous new parents are. So I got a book, and I trained myself in structured programming. And I started making screensavers. And after about 6 months, he said, yeah, just keep doing what you're doing in the lab. He said, but I got a project for you. He said, I want you to work on the fundamental problem of photography, how to blow a small image up and keep its quality. It was pretty much totally unsolved at that point. And so for the next 6 years, I worked on that. And as I did it, I trained myself in a broad range of computer skills, and I began to apply them in the laboratory. And they became a very important part of my research, basically rescuing it and extending it. And in 1998, you'll be familiar with this, around 1998, the first genuine fractals program, this fast Fourier transform system for blowing photographs up came out. It's not a perfect system by any means, but it's pretty powerful. And so my brother switched me to the Disney problem, and I won't take up a lot of time here describing what the Disney problem is, which I didn't solve. Nobody solved that. And so around 2001, 2002, I just used my skills in science for the next 10 years. And then around 2012, I began to there was an itch in my brain. I wanted to do art. And I thought, how can I do mathematical art that's different? You see all this fractal art. Much of it is beautiful and very impressive, but it's sort of very mathematical. It's very crystalline and hypergeometric.
Well, it has none of the fluidity of what I've seen you doing.
No, I wanted to do something that was painterly, that looked like, where even some artists would think I'd hand painted it, but do it with math, because I don't have any trained skill, and it would take me years to even try to learn how to use a brush and paint. And so I tried a couple of things. The first the first set of equations sort of looked like something your cat had scratched on. And then I revised that a lot, and it looked like the cat was a genius cat. The scratches were very well organized, and I was ready to walk away. I thought, this is a failure. But I had one more idea, and I tried it. And I'm an expert gardener, and so I put one of my flower photos in, and this really beautiful kind of flower came out, and I thought, hey, this works. And so I dived into it, and I began to expand the system. And at first I was manipulating colors mostly, and then started manipulating space and color together. And my brother was sort of my guide. I mean, he was my fierce critic, but he was also giving me ideas and teaching me how to think more critically about what I was doing.
So, Alan, if I could sort of summarize what you've just said to make sure that I'm understanding it, I know that high-level science can be very creative. So your creative impulse that perhaps was not fully satisfied through your scientific work, although that you've told me is very satisfying and accomplished, you wanted to try this other creative field, and you really didn't find the tools in the world, and so you created your own to accomplish your own end. So it's really a creative impulse that's been driving you.
Yeah, I didn't have any desire to learn to use Photoshop or Corel's Paint or any of the other powerful high-end systems, which are pretty wonderful. I mean, other fellow digital artists use them very effectively. I just wanted to create something myself.
Yeah.
Perhaps the ironic part is, for many years before that, even though I didn't do anything, I was buying equipment to do music, and I thought I would do mathematical music, and I never did it. And then suddenly I found myself making visual art. This is sort of ironic to me.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Photoshop, and I was going to ask you about that. As a digital photographer, I had an analog camera for many years, but it was more a tool for me to use in my art history seminars in graduate school, you know, making illustrations. And I only would play with it as a creative instrument. But it was the digital camera and Photoshop and Corel and those kinds of programs you just mentioned that allowed me to feel like I could be creative in the medium of photography. So could you quickly sort of tell all of us what is the difference between a program like Photoshop and what you're doing?
Yeah, Photoshop, well, I guess there's two elements. Photoshop allows you to use built-in mathematical systems to do all kinds of changes in the color structure and to create to hybridize images in multiple layers, which can give you all kinds of wonderful effects. And there is a section of it where you can actually use, I guess, a tablet, and you can move pixels around and change colors.
Yeah.
You somewhat the way, you know, a manual painter would do it. So it's an incredibly powerful program. I mean, but I was interested in doing something different. You know, again, you know, I guess part of it is the fact that when you do science, when you do, you know, real physical science, you fall in love with mathematics. Its power is almost magical. There's a famous essay about it by the great physicist Eugene Wigner. It's quite famous among scientists. The unreasonable power of mathematics in science. And I felt, well, let's see what I can do with it, because that's something I can work with. That's something that I'm.
Alan, let me interrupt if I may. Let me ask you two things about what you're describing. Am I hearing, first of all, that Photoshop was not powerful enough for what you wanted to do, or it simply wasn't capable of the kind of freedom that you wanted in the creative process?
You can't do anything like this in terms of the actual methodology in Photoshop, because all of the tools are below the hood. You learn to manipulate them. It's the difference between building a car and driving a car.
Yeah.
Okay?
Good. That's a good analogy. That makes sense to me as
I'm
a
building
user.
a car,
Yeah.
you know, and,
Yeah.
and then I'm driving it. But you know, when the car doesn't do what I want, I go under the hood and I change the engine.
Yeah.
You don't do that in Photoshop. And
Right.
so I'm doing something, certain things that are just not done in any of these other CAN programs.
Well, that's a good segue then into the images that you've created. I think so. Martha, if you want to give us the first image, and right now, Alan, as we make this shift, because I don't even think I have the capability to understand the mathematical aspect. I'm going to ask you to, when we go to an image, to just briefly describe what it is and what the starting point was and what you did in terms of manipulation. Okay.
Okay. When my daughter was a teenager, she went on a trip to Israel and she stopped in the Netherlands. And she spent about a day there. I guess it was there was a layover, and she hired a driver to drive her around. And at that time, she was enamored of photography, and she was pretty good at it. I wish she'd stuck with it. And she took a number of really interesting pictures, which I use as paint. I use those as starting points. So she took this picture of this beautiful old antique windmill out in some field outside of Amsterdam. And so this is a manipulated color and space manipulated piece taken from the windmill. You can, it's close enough. You can kind of get a sense of an old antique windmill, but this thing has been, you know, to me, the nice thing about this is it's sort of transformed so it looks like high tech, and then the colors are sort of organic. So there's a sense of, you know, green energy, solar energy, but you know, as I said, the old and the new. It's a sort of a representing the way modern windmills are less romantic, but you know, very powerful in terms of helping us do the right thing in terms of energy by the civilization.
Alan, I could almost imagine doing this with some of the more powerful tools in Photoshop. Is that fair, or is that selling what you accomplished here short from a mathematical?
I'm sure if you imagined it in your head and you started with the photo that I'm talking about, you could do this. I would think you could. You have to imagine it. The tool that I use produces images at a rather extraordinary rate. An image like this might take me 30 seconds. You certainly can't do that in Photoshop.
Yeah.
And so I'm making many images, throwing them away, and then manipulating the equations and trying to, you know, develop a maximum aesthetic, which is similar to what an artist is doing.
Yeah.
In the sense of, you know, you do some, you know, if you were doing candid photography, or you're a photographer, I mean, you go out and you see a scene and you do it from different angles, or you wait for the light to be right. In other words, you experiment with it. And it's rare that you just take one shot. You might, if you get a great shot, but and especially if it's dynamic. But if it's static, you might want to study it. And the same thing for someone doing plein air painting, I think, similar.
Well, what I think is impressive in hearing what you just described as your process is my use of Photoshop or Lightroom, sort of the kiddie version of Photoshop, is that I can't go beyond the tools that I'm given because I don't have control under the hood, as I think is the analogy you're using. You can go under the hood and say, well, I visualize this and I want to change the program to accomplish it, right?
Exactly. I mean, usually I'm just manipulating the parameters of the equations. In other words, you know, exponents or coefficients and things like that.
Yeah.
But sometimes, because I have far more equation sets than I can possibly explore in my lifetime, I'll work with a set that I'd say, I think this might be interesting, and I work with it for a while, and it's recalcitrant. It doesn't produce nice art. So I go in and start changing the equations, and I say, I'll do this, and I'll make it this way, and make it that way. I add this term here, and so I'm trying to make a better tool.
Yeah.
Right? It's sort of like making a better paintbrush or mixing better paints or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking of as you were talking. Well, let's look at the next image, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about this is another one that's fairly straightforward. I think we can all recognize the barn, and I know this has great importance in to you as a subject that you return to often. But in talking about this, could you also talk about how you regard color and how you select color and manipulate color?
Yeah. Okay. This is a friend has an organic farm in deeply rural Pennsylvania. He's a great farmer, and he had this old antique barn, and visitation day at the farm, I took a picture of that barn. And I'm glad I did. The health department made him repanel it because they didn't like the old wood, and he was storing some food in there.
Really?
So I have this great photo, and I go back to it over and over again. Yeah, color. Well, I should add that even though the vast majority of my pieces are extremely abstract, Monet is my favorite painter. I love his work dearly, and I feel a great connection to him in a lot of ways because he was a master gardener as well. And so this is impressionist, like you could imagine Monet painting something like this. The way I manipulate color, my program has two parts. The main part manipulates space, and if we have time, I can go into exactly how that's done. And then there's a special part for color manipulation. Now, one of the things that big commercial programs like Corel and like Photoshop are really good at is providing you a lot of tools to manipulate color in many different ways. But I wanted to do it in a way that isn't, again, commercially available. When I manipulate color to get, again, this, as you can see, it looks like somebody painted this, right?
Yeah.
I go to each pixel in the image, and I input the color values from all the pixels around it, and mathematically transform them, summing them and transforming them to transform the pixel in the center, and do that for every pixel in the image. And by using all kinds of, different kinds of mathematical transformations of those pixels, you can draw out very complex patterns that are basically hidden in the numbers that define the image.
Wow. So how many megapixels are in a file like this one?
Well, almost all my images have come from either my phone or originally from my old digital camera that I bought in the early 2000s. Nothing special. It always produced 5 megapixel images. So with few exceptions, I use these 5 megapixel images.
Okay.
And by keeping that number stereotypical, it makes it easier. I mean, I could hybridize pixels, images of different sizes, but it involves writing more software than is convenient. Yeah. So it's much easier to just hybridize them when they're all the same size.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very practical thing to do, but it makes me even more amazed at all the different effects you've been able to get, because I imagined that you had, 100 megapixels or some such number like that. Shows how little I know about the process you're using. Let's look at the next image then, please.
Yeah. It's funny. this is more typical of, I think, most of my work. It's extremely abstract. Now, this should amuse some people who are watching, I hope. If they tried to guess what the original image was, I'm pretty sure I could wager that no one would guess.
No,
okay?
I know I would.
Okay, so this was originally a picture of my daughter's printer. Now, I don't know, the little view, let's see, the little view window here, that was a viewer on the printer. This was part of the side of the printer, but it, you would never know that.
No.
So what this reminds me of, in this series, is Gerhard Richter's flow series. That led to a kind of an amusing little anecdote in my early artistic life. I was a member of a large cooperative in Maryland. And one day I was sitting with another artist who was like a lot of artists. He didn't like digital art, and he certainly didn't like art done with mathematics. He thought if you don't use your hands, it's not legitimate. So there was a great deal of hostility that he had towards my work. So, and I didn't know this at the time. We'd started off being friendly. Things soured later. But one day a number of my fellow artists, for many years I was a member of the Foundry Gallery in Washington. And some of my friends there told me that this looked like a Richter. So I had a series of images, and I asked him while we were sitting in the gallery together, which one looked more like a Richter to him. And this is the one that looked more like it than any of the others for me. And so he looked at them and he picked this one out too. And then he turned to me and he made this little speech. He said, well, but the difference between you and Richter is Richter knows exactly what he's doing. And you put these things in the equations and you let it run and you don't know what's going to happen. And I found that sort of startled me because he was completely wrong, upside down, inside out, and backwards. Because I control every single pixel. If I keep a record, which I can do, I don't normally do it. Artists don't keep a record of which brush strokes they use.
Right.
But because it's mathematical, I can keep a record of it. And I can duplicate it completely or change little pieces. I mean, I have control over it.
Right.
If anyone who knows the modern art knows how Richter does his flow series, he pours paint on a big sheet.
Yep.
He pushes it around with a sponge, which is not exactly fine art. And then he takes this giant piece of glass and he goes splat and he lets it stochastically spread. He doesn't control it. Yep. And if you know the history of the man, he's a brilliant neorealist artist. I mean, his early work, sometimes you think you're looking at photographs. It's like Chuck Close. I mean, he's tremendously talented as a classical artist. But in his life, he's more interested in abstract. And he's more interested in giving up control. So what the guy said was exactly sort of the opposite of reality. I mean, I have more control than he has. But
well, I'll throw in, Alan, a little art history here. You mentioned Monet as a favorite artist, and I'm sure you know the work of Vasily Kandinsky, the first really articulate proponent of total non-objectivity in the art of painting. And somebody once challenged him by saying, well, what do you think of Monet? His response was, I think, a perfect response. He said, Monet is only an eye, but what an eye.
Yeah.
And and also on a personal note, one of my closest friends is a connoisseur and expert in prints and printmaking. And I know that he does not fully respect my art of photography. I don't mean me personally, I mean photography in general. Because to him, there's not enough handwork. And if it doesn't have, he admires the technical control of a great etcher, for instance. So I sympathize with you completely, and I'm impressed by the amount of control that you have, that you're explaining, and the way you utilize it. And so I want to be sure that we can look at all the images that we've selected for discussion tonight, because I think they're really quite stunningly beautiful. So tell us a little about the whale.
The whale. Yeah, this is typical of pieces that I've manipulated repeatedly, such that I have no idea where they started. I can't tell you which photograph this originally was. I could probably guess as to which mathematical unit I used, at least for part of it, because of these lines on the left and lines on the bottom are characteristic of a particular module that I've used. But it's so abstracted, I don't know. For me, what pieces like this show is that I can do sort of minimalist abstracts with this system, right? In other words, that I don't have to, I like complexity in my work, and most of my abstracts are very complex. But, minimalism is central to art as well. And so that's what images like this, do for me, that I like sometimes to do very, very minimalist images.
Did the palette of color that you began with, and I'm only asking this because of the striations you see in the upper left and the lower right, was the palette of color in the original image more varied than red and blue? Can you say that?
Probably.
Probably.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I'm just curious, because you've distilled it down and managed the formal aspects so well. I just wondered if there was more color somehow back.
The way of there's a certain way to use some of the color filters that I've written, such that you're basically transforming some colors and suppressing others.
Yeah.
And so you can do that. You can sort of compress the color palette.
Yeah, so there could be others, but through the process of your digital manipulations, you've distilled it to this.
Yeah, sure.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Well, I think I find this, perhaps because of the simplicity and the sort of the coloristic resonances, this is, to me, a lovely image. Very fine. So let's look at the next, please, Martha. Now, is this really originating in a photograph of a clematis?
Yes, it is. Clematis Josephine, for those of you who are gardeners, if you like, especially if you like clematis and you haven't grown Josephine, I highly recommend it. It's a double clematis. It's just a gorgeous piece. A piece like this, where I've manipulated only space and left the colors intact, it illustrates something that I sort of discovered, which I don't have a real explanation for. Cause probably I don't understand the psychology of imagery well enough. Never studied it. But when I don't manipulate color, it always strikes me, or most of the time, it strikes me that the resultant images, even when they're highly abstract in structure, still retain more of a photographic quality. I mean, this looks to me, say, far more like a photograph than the previous image, which looked like a painting.
Yeah.
Right? But
I agree. It almost looks like a wind-blown blossom. I mean, I have a clematis on my mailbox post, and when the blossoms are blowing in the wind, they very often, to the eye, look momentarily like this. So yeah. I'm struck by that as well, and I think you're quite right in the way you just explained it. I think this should inspire your presentation a lot of questions, and I want to leave adequate time. But I think we have at least one more image, so let's look at that before we start to take questions.
Yeah. I think if I can figure out what I started with here. Probably I can't. You know, this, as I said, illustrates the degree to which I like to plunge. Oh, and now I can tell you, this is also done from the printer. You may remember that other
Your
image.
daughter's printer?
My daughter's printer is this is on the side of the printer.
Wow.
But you wouldn't know it. I mean,
no.
So again, here you see, one of the things that's true about manual art and the world, if you think of flowers as an example, is that there's imperfect symmetry. It's part of the organic structure of the world. So when I do this, I try to get a lot of complex symmetries that are broken, because to me that produces a more powerful aesthetic. And this is a really good example of that.
Well, it's I think when you mentioned a couple of times that it's still originated in the printer, are those buttons some of the controls that form the circles?
Yeah. I think the circles, at least some of them, came from those buttons.
Yeah, I wouldn't have known that, though, if you hadn't said what you started with. So, Martha, I can't remember. Is there another image? Okay, well, Alan, I think you've given us an awful lot to think about, and certainly you've convinced me that this is a very powerful creative tool that you are using in a very creative manner. So let's open it up to questions, and you can either wave your hand or use the chat function, and Martha will control. Oh, Martha wants to ask a question. Is that true, Martha?
I do. Yes, I do. I'm demonstrating, but I would also like to ask a question. So I'm really interested in, it's kind of a two-part question of how you choose your subjects, which it seems just like you can take anything and you find it in anything, your art, whether it's a printer or like a vacation photo from your daughter, which is really interesting. But you also have this process, and I'm not super versed in mathematics, but I know that like choosing your values, you can choose like, if something's red, it can go left. If it's something like right, then it can go blue or something like that. You could do a lot of different powerful things with the equations that you can develop. So like, I think there's kind of a two-part question of choosing your subjects of the image itself and then choosing the subjects of your values. And I wonder the process for how you, and maybe this goes back to maybe more just like mathematical like theory or something like that, but how you choose subjects is really interesting.
I guess that it would be in two different categories. So, some of the subjects I choose just because, you know, they're aesthetically interesting. Some landscape issues, like what's in back of my head right now, came from, you know, we go to the Cape Cod each year and each summer and stay with a friend, and you walk around, you take pictures. The Cape is tremendously picturesque of the forests and the marshes, and that you saw that barn and the windmill, and then some of it's portraiture, pictures of my brother, my niece, myself, pictures of animals, dogs. So, and then, you know, there are a few themes that have emerged over the years. I mean, which then direct me to particular images. So the windmill has become the basis for kind of solar energy themes, you know, because I think that's important for an educated person to care about, you know, things like climate change and making our energy better. I'd say two and a half years ago, I thought I should do something with social value. I mean, directly. And I thought, why don't I see what I can do with the president? You know, he's an interesting subject. He's always angry, the previous president. And so I have hundreds of satirical portraits of the president, which are probably not worth very much money now. And my family never let me display them. She said no one would want to buy them. And I used to say, well, the ACLU may want to hang them in the bathroom, so maybe I can sell them. So there's that. At the gallery that I was a member of, and I'm still an adjunct member of, they would hold, up until COVID ended it, maybe 2 times a month, they'd have classic sessions where they'd cover the windows and they'd pay young women to come in and pose nude. So both guest artists and members could come in and do a classic painting of the nude human figure. And the women generally would let me photograph, and then I would manipulate that. And so that's produced a whole set of extremely surreal nudes. So some of it's philosophical in the sense of having investigating either a classic line or some sort of social line, and some of it's just the aesthetics of landscapes. I do a lot of manipulation of pictures of silk flowers and vases, because my mother, at the end of her life, she was a brilliant landscaper, but at the end of her life, where she couldn't do that anymore, she became a silk flower arranger. And on my last trip to Florida with her, I said, you can't sell these, you can't drive. Let me take pictures of all of them. And so we spent a day taking about 80 pictures of different, apartment was full of them. Wow. And so I used those. Fairly extensively for still lives. Okay.
Well, it sounds like you're doing what most of us do, which is things that are accessible, familiar, interesting to us in some way, whatever it is. We take it and we run with it, and we try to turn it into something that's more expressive of our own feelings and thoughts. So that's an interesting response from somebody that is creating the kind of imagery that you're doing, but very typical of most of us, I think. So I see Chris has posted a picture. A question.
Yeah, I get asked that a lot. If I set up a new set, generally I'm using like 4 sets of equations, and the output of each set goes into the next set. So if I take an image, like this was a grove of trees, and I put it into a new chain of equations that I've never used before, the first time I run it, I have no idea what's going to come out. Absolutely none. And in that sense, the way I describe it to people, it's like candid photography. If you go out in the woods with your camera, you don't know whether you're going to see a scarlet tanager or a dragonfly or, I don't know, a fish jumping in a lake. You don't know what you're going to see. But once it comes out, if it looks like it's going to be an aesthetically interesting direction, then I can manipulate the equations to 1 part in 10 to the 18th, a billionth of a billionth,
I think this might be a good jumping off point for a question that Chris just put in the chat, which is, to what extent do you know what will result from your manipulations, and or what the extents are that you're surprised at the results?
Well, that's what I'm saying. In other words, initially, it's always a surprise. And then I start manipulating it, and I can manipulate it a lot or a little bit, and I start pushing it around, and I can see how each change moves it or distorts the image, and keep trying to push it into a more aesthetic direction that talks to me. And again, I think that's like when people do studies, whether they're photographic or painting, of a particular scene or image, and they're trying to structure it to reach what they consider an aesthetic max.
Yeah. That makes sense to me.
That's what I do.
Anybody else? Questions?
We do have a question from Alan Naiman, which is, do you usually start with a photograph?
Yes, I'm almost always start with a photograph. My brother passed away about a year ago, but not long before he passed away, he told me that I should also try to create just straight abstracts, you know, from mathematical inputs. And I've done some work like that, and then sometimes hybridizing those straight mathematical pieces with photographs, but almost always I start with a photograph. I'm interested in seeing what I can extract from if you will, real world images, because I like a lot of structure even in my abstracts. I mean, I think that's because I'm a biologist. I mean, I study the most complex structures in the universe, which are living things, especially people, and you know, at the molecular level, and so that appeals to me. And photographs initially, of course, are full of meaningful structure. So the question is, what happens when you start moving that structure around and in hybridizing it with other structures? And you know, an early a person who was an early practitioner of this was Picasso. I mean, if you look at his Cubist phase, he's injecting the synthetic into the organic, and he's trying to see how that affects our psychology of ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a very good insight into his portraits. I think his Cubist portraits, if you watch some of them evolve. So, Martha, somebody else have a question?
Yes, there's two questions about I think this is going to be something very technical to answer, but someone asked the question of, can you explain more about the technique? Is it like processing / coding? And then someone else asked, are the pixels converted to math?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll try to give you the explanation that I worked up for what I call the lay audience. In a digital image, each pixel is represented by a triplet. In memory, you see it as you see this RGB, red, green, blue, but in memory it's actually blue, green, red. Doesn't matter. The point is that those are the voltages that are going to be applied to the phosphors on your screen. And the way human vision works, there's a red phosphor, a green phosphor, and a blue phosphor. The way human vision works, when you mix those at different levels, you can create every color that the human eye can see. There's 256 levels, and so that cube gives you 16 million colors. Even an artist doesn't see more than about 8 million. So you've got those triplets, okay? What I do is I feed those numbers and then the position numbers, and then you can create cyan, yellow, and magenta with a small mathematical, phrase of the red, green, blue, and there's some other values that I take, and I feed those numbers into a first set of equations, then a second, then a third, and sometimes a fourth. What comes out the other end is a new pixel position. If I want, I can also manipulate colors simultaneously, but I usually do that separately afterward. So what it means is I go to each pixel in the picture, and I take these numbers associated with its color and its position, and I run it through the equations, and the equation comes out and it says, now I've identified a pixel over here in somewhere else in the painting, and it takes that pixel and it moves to this position. So you can imagine that what it's like is, imagine that you have a canvas and wet paint on it, okay? And it's an image, like it's a wet photograph or a wet painting. And you have a brush that has got a tip so fine that it actually can pick up a single dye element. And then you're taking that brush and you're putting it on a dye element and you're moving it to another place in the picture. So you're swirling the picture around pixel by pixel, except it's being driven by the math, okay? And that's how I get such powerful reconstructions, because pixel by pixel, I'm swirling them around, okay? But I'm doing it in this sort of ordered or structured way, although it can be quite complex. And then for color manipulation, I think I mentioned this before. In general, what I do is I put it into the color engine. I put it into the color part of the program, and then I manipulate each pixel by doing mathematical transformations on the pixels surrounding it, either the 8 or the 16 or the 25 surrounding it. And then that changes that pixel. And I do that pixel by pixel going through the picture. So that's sort of an analogy as to what I do. Okay, I mean, if you think of that brush and paint kind of analogy.
Well, Alan, you're making my head feel like it's going to explode in a good way, because this is so, in the broadest sense, it's so much what I think artists do, whatever their material is, at least two-dimensional artists. But it's so complex on such a high level of mathematics. I have a simplistic question. How long does the program have to run to make the transformations you just described?
A 5 million pixel piece generally takes about 30 seconds.
Wow. Now, I saw a question pop up in the chat. Does anybody else do what you do? I think you said this is proprietary. This is your program,
Yeah.
and nobody else has it.
No, it's all the software is mine.
Yeah.
The only thing I use Photoshop for instance, is I use it to print. It's a wonderful printing device.
Yeah.
And I use it sometimes to analyze the quality of a piece. So you may remember that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that my brother wanted me to work on the blow up problem. About a month into making this painting system, I realized that the way it was working with edges gave me a new way to think about how to attack the blow up problem. And I started working on it, and my brother got real excited. And he said, "Come on, do it." And some friends said, "Do it." And so the following summer, I worked on it, and it worked. And then I wrote a provisional patent. I've written biomedical patents, and I write that. And about a year later, the patent office gave me the patent, so it's patented. And I used that to blow up my images. So if I want to make an image that's, say, 6 feet by 8 feet and have extremely high quality from a 5 million pixel image, I can do it. I use my own software. But a lot of times when I'm blowing it up, there are a lot of parameters that I can vary in that system. I'll put it into Photoshop and I'll blow it up and I'll look at the pixels so I'm checking on quality, and it's really nice to do that. But most of what Photoshop offers, I don't use. I mean, it's such a powerful program, but I don't use that. That's what I use it for.
Well, Alan, this has really been a fascinating discussion. At least I feel so, and I'm sure most of our audience or all of our audience does. But we are running out of time. So let's take one more question before we say goodnight. Who has a burning question that they absolutely want to get?
I think Emma asked a really interesting question in the chat, which is, do you have some favorite go-to equations that you use frequently? And then he also has a comment that it might be interesting to see a series of images created from different photos, but applying the same equation.
Do I have go-to equations? I have to think about that for a second. No, actually, I don't think so. I experiment with a very wide range, and each different kinds of equations, logarithmic or trigonometric or certain kinds of calculus in numerical calculus equations, numerical integral equations, produce very different effects, and so they're all interesting. So I don't think I can say that.
It's almost like asking a painter if he or she has a favorite color.
Yeah, well, some painters do, I guess.
Yeah.
But,
well, look, we've run out of time, and so I hate to cut people off. And when this happens, you can send your chat questions in, and Martha can forward them on to Alan, and hopefully, he'll get back to you. But I want to thank you all for tuning in tonight and joining us again, and especially thank Martha for her help as always. And Alan, it's really been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you very
and
much for the opportunity. It was a
Well,
lot of fun.
I'm so glad you responded and we were able to do this. And good night to everybody. And I hope to see you again in 2 weeks, if not sooner.
If I can plug it also, the artist that we're going to have in 2 weeks is Deb Comelin. She is someone who's been very involved with MFA for a while, but also she's a very interesting photorealistic painter. So it'll be a very interesting talk with her.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Good night.